In a certain way, I don't think it's necessarily bad that the government could share something if there's threat information, but we have to have guardrails. We have to have some kind of a system where they can communicate that in a non-coercive way, and we don't have those. We have a back channel system where a guy knocks on my door or somebody just calls up the CEO. That's the worst way that you could handle it.
Welcome to Undercurrents, our daily news show from Unheard's Washington Bureau. You can head to undercurrents.tv to watch premium content. Please like, share, and subscribe. I'm Robby Soave, filling in for Emily Jashinsky. Today's guest is Ken Klippenstein, an independent journalist who writes on Substack about national security, corruption in government and the business world, and also censorship. Ironically, Ken was recently the victim of censorship himself. He obtained and published the J.D. Vance dossier, a cache of internal Trump campaign documents detailing efforts by Trump's team to vet the prospective vice presidential candidates. Multiple media organizations received these documents from an unknown person, who was presumably an Iranian hacker. But these outlets declined to publish the dossier, given the source of the information and, according to them, its lack of relevance. Ken Klippenstein thinks you, the reader, ought to decide that for yourself. So he published the dossier on Substack and posted images, screenshots from it on X. Immediately thereafter, his X account was suspended. The platform's moderators contend that he had revealed private information about Vance and that this was against the rules of the platform. But earlier this week, X restored Klippenstein's account after Elon Musk personally intervened, according to Ken. Klippenstein wrote that this effectively meant Elon has, quote, accepted defeat. Why did Musk capitulate, wonders Klippenstein. Perhaps it was the mainstream media pile-on that followed from the Times story, he says. Or, more generously, perhaps it was Musk's commitment to keeping X open. Here to discuss censorship on social media, Elon Musk's policies, what was really in the Vance dossier, is Ken Klippenstein himself. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
Right off the bat, let's get into your recent visit from the FBI about the Vance dossier that you published. We're obviously going to talk about the censorship on X and all of that, but you actually were visited by an FBI agent. Tell us about it.
Yeah, so I'm kind of two minds about this because on the one hand, I think that in the abstract, it's creepy, but in the specifics of my visit, there were a number of sort of comic aspects, and I'll explore that in a moment here. So when he introduced himself to me, he's a very young man, looked to be about 25 years old. I asked if he was from the Milwaukee field office. I live in Madison, Wisconsin. That's the only field office we have in the state. And he said that he was from a satellite office in Middleton. The FBI has all sorts of satellite offices to be able to function through different states. It just gives you a sense of how big and sprawling the national security community has become. And after he did that, he showed me his badge. I was able to take a look at his badge. I know what these look like. I'm a national security reporter, so he was who he said he was. And then he kind of very stiffly read a statement that was printed out on a piece of paper. I asked him, can I take a picture of the bag? Can I take a picture of the statement? And he said no to both. And the funniest thing about the visit was he was kind of apologetic about it. He seemed to think that it was a little bit untoward that the FBI was coming to do media. And when he read me the statement, which informed me that I had been the target, I was believed by the FBI to be a target of a foreign nation state influence campaign target at the election, an obvious reference to my decision to publish the J.D. Vance dossier 2 weeks prior to this. And so he reads me, but it's about a paragraph long, maybe 4 sentences or so, nothing very detailed. And then I responded to him, I said, yeah, I know that because it was in my article. Didn't you see it? And he goes, oh, I didn't read the article. And I was like, they sent somebody who didn't read the article to brief me on the article's role in a foreign influence campaign. He's like, look, man, my boss has, had me do this. Like, I don't really know what's going on. And so I kind of interrogated him in a friendly way because he was sort of a nice guy and he didn't seem to be completely on board with what was going on. And so I asked him, I said, what took you guys so long? Because I wasn't expecting a visit from the Bureau, but I thought I would get some kind of communique because these agencies, they do notify companies, like social media companies, for example. So I expected some kind of communication. I said, what took you guys so long? He goes, how long ago was the story? I said, 2 weeks ago. He says, 2 weeks is pretty fast for the federal government. And we both just kind of laugh. And the whole thing had a sort of like comic quality to it.
That warms my libertarian heart very much to be laughing about like that, government incompetence in the follow-up for intimidating reporters who published information, although you're saying it's not very intimidating.
Right, by a representative of the government. And so then I asked him, I said, okay, so I knew all this. I put it prominently in my story, and this is a point I've tried to stress in interviews with people. I think that there's a false choice presented between do you publish the documents or do you not? There's a whole gulf between those of how do you publish the documents? Are you doing it in a responsible way that informs the public about their provenance so that they can make an informed decision for themselves about how to decide what these records mean and to situate them within the understanding that nation states want this because in the case of Iran, they have incentives to want Harris to win because Trump has more hardline policy on Iran. And I did all of that in the story. And so I said, being that I prominently mentioned that, like towards the top, like this was in the lead of the story, why are you guys notifying me of something that I clearly already know? And he just shrugged. He was stumped. He didn't know. He said, look, man, I just got sent out here to read this thing. I don't really know what it's about. And so I asked him if he could, email me the statement and some information about what's going on. He seemed sincere when he said, yes, I will try to. And I haven't heard anything back from them. I contacted the Washington field office for comment, asking them if they've done this to other reporters, because I can't find other examples of it happening to other reporters. And they did respond, but they said we declined to comment. And so that's pretty much all we know.
I want to get into the content of the dossier in a minute, but first, this is fascinating that this is what counts as foreign election interference these days. You obtained information you recognize a hacker who probably, maybe, Iranian origin. Let's say they have a nefarious purpose in doing this, or nefarious from the standpoint of U.S. intelligence. The information they obtained is accurate information. It is what it's not been misrepresented. It is an internal Trump campaign document, and they gave it to you, and you published it. And that's you're not. To say that that's serving Iran's interest, just to give like the American people information that the Trump campaign already had about its vice presidential candidate, is really bringing the concept of I guess we're all influencing the election then, right? I'm influencing it on my news shows when I say things I think are bad about Kamala Harris or Donald Trump. You're doing the same. The word foreign itself is like trying to bring up the maliciousness of this without actually making it any more dangerous.
Yeah, and Trump himself, obviously the head of the campaign, has said, those documents aren't a very big deal. It's mostly open source stuff, which was true. He was right about that. I thought he took a responsible tone, didn't play into the hysteria that I think has swept across the country since 2016 in particular, and the Russian influence campaign, which I don't deny and exists, and I would like for that stuff not to happen, but it does. And I think that part of this is that, particularly in the liberal psyche, Trump winning in 2017 was a traumatic thing for them. And so one of the ways in which they processed it was to say, well, actually, it was the Russians that did it. It wasn't actually the electorate that had a fair choice, which is completely there's no evidence for that. The Russian measures had an appreciable effect, or certainly a determinative effect on the election outcome. But that is a sort of theology that emerged and many people still believe. And because of that, the national security state has seen that and said, oh, so I guess we better get involved in foreign influence to a degree that we haven't in the past. And I think that's what leads to them knocking on a reporter's door to tell him something that he, or I in this case, already know.
So let's talk about your decision to publish the dossier. Multiple other journalistic mainstream outlets got this same information, presumably from the same hacker. They looked at it and decided not to publish it. I don't think any of them said we would never in a million years under any circumstances publish this because it was hacked, although that might be their true internal thoughts. I don't know. That would definitely be a new thing because journalistic outlets have published illicitly obtained materials in the past, and it's not illicitly obtained by them. It just kind of falls into their hands. What they seemed to say this time was that there's not enough that's new or novel in this information to make it worth publishing. You obviously disagreed. Part of that is philosophically, if I'm understanding, you thought readers, yes, viewers, etc. should make that decision. But you also thought there was something presumably legitimate in there that might be of interest in terms of what the Trump campaign thought about its own vice presidential choice.
Yeah, there are two factors to this. I don't see how the media... First of all, something like a dozen outlets were given this and passed on it, which in itself is a bit of a scandal. When in this country, politically, can you get 12 people to agree on anything?
I was shocked that they all
much
passed
less
on
the
it.
Media.
100% shocked by it.
Yeah, much less the media, which is supposed to be disputatious and stroppy and questioning things and fighting, and debating things. Just a total blanket blackout on this. And it was honestly, it felt kind of Soviet to me. Like, I don't want to overstate it, but it's like a little bit creepy that you couldn't get one guy that had a different view on it on a document about a vice presidential nominee that there's clearly a lot of buzz about. Like, I don't base my decisions on, what is the public saying or whatever, but you don't have to look very far to see people are curious about this thing. What does it say? What is it about? So to me, I've had edge cases before where it's kind of like, do we run with this? Do we not? This wasn't one of them. I felt quite confident about this, even though the rest of the media decided otherwise. And so, looking through the report, I think there are two ways to look at it. One is to just look at the specific bits of information, which Trump correctly pointed out are, open source, and you can go out there and look at it and verify it. So it's not new in that sense. I think part of media passing on this is a reflection of their, I think, quite vain obsession with novelty. Like, ooh, technically this isn't new. I can't tell you how many stories I've had where it's kind of like a fight with management that it's like, this is already out there. But what they mean by that is Washington.
You're talking about the scoop-driven culture of DC journalistic reporting.
Yes. But as defined by information that Washington is already familiar with. I submit that if you go through those details, ordinary people don't have any idea about most of those policies. And in fact, what you find is a picture of Vance that was quite different than I think what the popular imagination might suggest. I was surprised at how nuanced he was on certain things. He was not a cookie cutter Republican senatorial to vice presidential pipeline candidate that you might expect. I mean, there were disagreements with Trump, for example, on the assassination of Qasem Soleimani in Iran. I found that quite interesting. There were disagreements on all sorts of other foreign policy stuff that I honestly think probably is more in line with what the Republican electorate thinks than Trump's position on those things. So on several levels, I didn't see it as something that hurt them. I mean, I guess you're not excited as Trump put it well. He said, Trump hacked us, quote, never a nice thing to do. Yeah, never a nice thing to do. But I don't think it's like the sky is falling, right? And so I kind of looked through it and to compare it to some other things, like this was nothing like the Steele dossier, where it has these unverified. I mean, I would never have published that because you can't verify any of that. Like, it doesn't matter who it's about. You can't just run these kind of salacious allegations against someone that you have no idea if it's true or not. This was the opposite of that. All of this stuff was publicly verifiable. So to me, it was an easy call, and I'm frankly befuddled at how much of a debate and I didn't think there should have been any attendant controversy. And when I published it, I didn't really expect any, to be honest. I was surprised at what followed.
It shows the pervasiveness of the fear over foreign influence tied exactly to what you just said. 2016, that being the convenient excuse of many mainstream institutions and the Democratic Party itself acquitting their candidate of any failings and deciding that, yes, it was all Russian influence and Russian bots. Of course, Russia did make some clumsy, I would argue, attempts to intervene on social media and all that. The idea that, I mean, it was a close enough election that there are a bunch of things that make a small amount of difference, but the idea that, these very not targeted precisely at the voters in the swing states efforts on social media ended up mattering more than what the millions and millions and millions of dollars in advertising or free promotion they get on their own partisan media channels matters more. You have to be totally just not keyed into, the kind of voter who switched from, who was maybe would have voted for Hillary or voted for Trump, very plugged into talk radio and all those things in Pennsylvania and Michigan. The idea it's like Russia reached into their minds and duped them is just so comical, but so pervasive in our mainstream media organizations.
Yeah, I think it's comical, but it's also corrosive and kind of insidious because it's leading people to make decisions that are affecting speech. And not just, I'm a very small example of this. I've written about the coordination with social media companies to respond to these foreign influence operations. Again, if I encourage people to just look at the scholarship on this, there's been good studies on Russian influence operations, which, by the way, are identified by the intelligence community as the leading threat, not Iran. And what they find is that they're incompetent, they're ineffective. They might provide a sort of solace to the leadership in Moscow that they're like, yeah, we did something, we got someone, but there's no evidence that it's ever swung an election. There just isn't. I looked, and there's good research on this since 2016 in particular, but preceding that as well. And so I feel like there's a kind of moral panic about this stuff that is way out of proportion to what the threat is, because it's real. And, when you have things like AI that could scale up their ability, these nation states' ability to do disinformation. So I don't dispute that it's real and that it could be a threat, but not anything we've seen, and certainly not a open source Vance dossier. So it's not that I'm critical of there being a response to it. I just wish the response had some sense of proportionality. It's so blown out of proportion. I don't think we need to be making it so that people posting a link to a news article have their accounts suspended unless they remove it. I mean, it's just like, it's acting like it's 9/11, and it's just not,
Yeah, which is exactly what happened to you. Obviously, you tweeted, posted on X screenshots from the dossier that resulted in your account being suspended. You couldn't access it. I know this happened to other people. This happened to a coworker of mine at Reason Magazine, Eric Boehm, who also tweeted a screenshot, and he got locked out of his account for some amount of time. Now, there's a discussion over, so I want to ask you about this, and you let us know about your level of communication that you actually had with moderators, if any. Some people were saying that it's because in that screenshot there was personal information in the terms of social security number, address, phone number, that goes against the site's policies, and that was the reason that action was taken.
Yes, that was the reason that X cited in its correspondence with me about my suspension. Let me explain why I think that was a pretext to get rid of the article for political reasons. I think it was a pretext because if you look at Instagram, Facebook, Meta, even Google Drive was removing the document. You couldn't store it in Google Drive. I've never heard of them exercising content moderation before, but they did it. And
Google
I think
Drive?
Those companies were more candid. Yes. Yeah, you couldn't store it in Google Drive. I think those companies were more honest. They never said anything about private information. They said, this is a foreign influence operation. That's why we're taking it down. X was different, I think, because Musk has branded it as a free speech haven. And so he was under some kind of pressure to make an argument for why this is a necessary exception to that. And so they said it was about the private information, that being a home address for JD Vance. And I think it was a phone number too. And then it was like the first 3 digits of the social security number or something. And the reason, I've stressed repeatedly that this document was open source, including all of that information. None of that is technically private. You can buy all that. That's how they got it. It wasn't given to them by Vance. You can find that on the internet. You can find that in his disclosure forms. You can find that all over. But I guess that Musk suggested that by posting that information, that's tantamount to some kind of threat. You'll recall people were posting about the location of his private jet. He said that was tantamount to a quote assassination coordinates. So he's clearly very sensitive about this. Maybe it was sincere. Can't rule that out. Maybe he just really cares about that particular issue. But so that was the reason that they cited for taking it down. There was a huge backlash, making essentially the point I did, which is that all this stuff is publicly available. It's about somebody that has a Secret Service detail. His family has a Secret Service detail. What ended up happening was on Friday of last week, the New York Times reported a new detail of the story saying that X connected with the Trump campaign about responding to the story and taking it down. And then there was just a firestorm, because then at that point it was like, oh my God, this is totally political. So I got a ton of more interview requests. There were a lot more stories. And then at that point, my account was reinstated, and I got a message from X after I had already appealed and they had denied my appeal. Suddenly they contacted me. This was unilateral from their end. They weren't responding to anything I said. They said, oh, actually, we think maybe the private information that you published was on accident, so we're going to go ahead and unsuspend you. And then I was back, and that's basically what happened.
And you said that you believe Elon Musk did personally intervene here in this case. Can you?
So I think I know he did, because I was given correspondence that he had with Brian Krasenstein, a political commentator on X, in which Brian was asking him about the status of my account. And he said that they were going to reinstate it forthwith. I don't remember exactly what the words were, but he said, even though I think that he is a terrible awful human being, is what he said, freedom of speech is more important, so I'll be reinstating him. And then it was like an hour after that I was reinstated. So it seems clear that this was he said that he personally had instructed X Safety, that's their like trust and safety team, to reinstate me.
There are a lot of parallels here to how the New York Post Hunter Biden laptop story was treated, obviously. And, we've learned so much since those days in terms of the FBI's communications with social media sites, the health officials' communications with social media sites during the pandemic, a lot of I would argue bad moderation decisions that were made by social media sites. After you see the emails, the constant discussions between federal agents and the platforms, I think in my case at least, I came off feeling a little bit more sympathetic to or sorry for the platforms themselves, facing just constant and increasingly aggressive dictates from the federal government that are very like, we'd really like you to do something about this. We'd really like you to do something about this. Are you going to do something about this, or are you going to get hauled before Congress? That kind of thing. Getting really direct over time, and you're seeing them cave, which was a shame, but I don't know. I think anybody might have caved under that situation. But also in terms of that that behavior ending up backfiring, having the Streisand effect, actually calling more attention to stories. And in the case of the New York Post laptop story, yes, they censored that on the platform, but then there were 1,000 stories about how it was being censored that called even more attention to it. And I think that might be a little bit of what happened in your case.
Oh, totally. I mean, again, I didn't expect this story to be particularly big. I thought it was newsworthy because it's about the vice presidential candidate and provides insight into his policy positions, and certainly more so than a lot of the celebrity kind of reporting you see about people's personal lives. But I didn't expect anything in the order of the response I got, and I don't think I would have gotten it. I don't think I'd be here now talking to you if it wasn't for their response, which is just stunning that they don't understand that. I mean, even on the narrow grounds of preventing the dissemination of this foreign hacked information, they failed miserably at that because it ended up reaching way more people. Because when you put it's like when you're a kid, they put the explicit lyrics label on. You're like, ooh, what is that? I want to see that now. And it's like they never learned that lesson. And I've reported on this kind of thing extensively, the coordination between government and social media companies. And it's very frustrating to me because I think disingenuously the federal government asserts that, oh, we're not actually issuing dictates. We're not forcing them to do anything. We're just asking. But again, like me getting visited by the FBI, that's what they would say about that. They'd say, oh, we're just notifying him. But what do you think if you're working for a publicly owned company that is that has contracts with the federal government, you're going to do if the FBI calls you and says, oh, by the way, you really should know about this foreign group, with the understanding that that could leak to the press, and then you could be said to be helping some foreign actor if you don't go along with them, or whoever knows what else if you don't cooperate with the government. I think that unavoidably constitutes some kind of a pressure. I mean, you can debate whether that's censorship or not. Maybe it's a light version of it. Maybe, I mean, but the idea that that isn't going to put some kind of burden on them at all, like it just seems very insincere to me to say that. And that's basically what we have to reckon with is how are we going to have guardrails to make sure that people aren't pressured into things?
We have a high level of agreement on this subject, so I want to go back to the private information thing and just push you on it a little bit for the sake of argument. Let's say I think probably my phone number and my address are public somewhere, or you could find it if you really went about Googling it. I can't say it's truly hidden information. But I don't know, if I had a political enemy, I'm trying to think, let's say the Southern Poverty Law Center says Robby Soave is a spreader of hate and, this is where he lives and, go protest. Don't do anything, not say do anything violent or illegal, but you should protest outside his apartment building. This is what it is. And if nobody showed up, I probably wouldn't care. But let's say I was being mobbed by actual activity because of that, I would probably flag it for Twitter and ask them to take it down. And if they have a policy against that kind of thing, I don't think that violates a principle of free speech to me. Now, I don't think the government obviously should do anything about it. I don't think the FBI should tell them to take it down. The government aspect of it, totally bad. But if they, for individuals who are, even public individuals, who you could work hard to find their private information, it's not truly private. If it's being blasted on social media, I think it's okay if they have a policy against that.
I understand. And I'm in the minority of opinion here, clearly. But we took a philosophical position on this prior to the story being published. This is a longstanding view of my editor and I, William Arkin. And, going through these kind of things, you very often find all sorts of edge cases. I'll give you an example from the Vance dossier itself. So then there are business addresses. Is that private? There are associates' addresses. There are associates' business addresses. There are former addresses. There are former business addresses. And at some point, it's like, well, where do you draw the line? It's like he's not in his house. He's campaigning. They all have Secret Service. And it's like, at a certain point, I mean, it feels to me that you have to do a balancing act between where are you going to make the referee call and how public of a person is this? Is this somebody that has protection, blah, blah, blah. And I actually looked at past cases about this because I was curious about the question. I couldn't find any evidence of somebody going out and carrying out violence against somebody because somebody posted honestly, I'll be real with you. I think there's something of a moral panic around this. And if you look at the word, for example, doxing and how loosely that is used. I've seen people use that to describe just posting a person's name who's already known. I feel like it's part and parcel of what we were talking about before, which is this drift towards censorship would be overstating it, but away from disclosure, I guess. And I guess in the context of a story that was like, I think the publisher should know this. And I was particularly frustrated by the media exercising, I call it media paternalism, just this nanny thing of like, oh, the public shouldn't know this because they're going to get the wrong idea about Iran and vote for the pro-Iran candidate or whatever. I was very frustrated about that. And it just felt hypocritical to be like, okay, so I'm doing this in part because I don't believe in media paternalism, but then I'm going to decide which stuff you can like entrust people with. And again, I recognize that's an unpopular view, but that's the one we took, and that's the one we take generally. I mean, we very much lean in the direction of disclosure when you've found that something is in the public interest. And if you want to compare it to the case that you just mentioned, Hunter Biden laptop, I mean, this didn't have pictures of his dick or whatever else that all that had. So like the same people getting irate about it were fine with like, I would consider actually quite invasive stuff being put out there. And so I think that speaks to the political polarization around the question, but that's essentially my view.
These can be tricky calls. I remember when I was doing more than I do now, reporting on, campus craziness or college students, shouting down speakers or that kind of thing. Over time, I became more careful about whether I was going to, use the student's full name. Now, in cases where I would be perfectly justified doing it, where, they went in public, holding a sign saying disinvite, Christina Hoff Sommers or Charles Murray, whoever it is, and, said a bunch of silly things and said, free speech is different than hate speech and, that kind of thing. And they're doing this in a public place and they're, not trying to conceal who they are. And I say, Annie Smith did this in, this is what she had to say. And then they would get, tons of hate and everything. And then I'd feel kind of bad because I wasn't trying to invite some horrible thing to happen to this person, but I did want to criticize and call out how they view free speech as part of a now well-recognized trend among elite college students that we're all paying a lot of attention to. But I also didn't want to ruin their lives or make them get death threats. But they were doing this in a public place, and it's hard to know.
It is.
Call down the right level of criticism on people via online platforms in general.
Totally. And that, in part, that's what we're stumbling through with the government stuff. Because in a certain way, I don't think it's necessarily bad that the government could share something if there's threat information. But we have to have guardrails. We have to have some kind of a system where they can communicate that in a non-coercive way. And we don't have those. We have a back channel system where a guy knocks on my door or somebody just calls up the CEO. That's the worst way that you could handle it. I mean, if they had sent me, the Bureau or the Justice Department or whatever had sent me a letter, I think that'd be fine. That's much different. I mean, maybe you could still say it's chilling, but it's different than getting a knock on your door that wasn't announced. I had no idea what was going to happen. And that's kind of what's at issue here is I do think these are complicated questions that don't have straightforward answers. But I also look at what we have now, the system we have now, and think, okay, that is straightforwardly not, that's not optimal.
Yeah, well, and the fact that there is some legitimate reason for the government to talk to social media sites in some cases is what's so horrifying about how badly they have abused it. Because yes, I think some rules around what kind of like child abuse materials on social media is totally fine.
Totally.
And social media companies due to they have a range of how they handle this, but in a lot of cases do a good job. They report tons of this kind of absolutely appalling illegal material to the authorities. Sometimes things aren't done about it on the authorities side, but it gets reported. I'm fine with in national intelligence people, if they're correct, pointing out like, oh, this ISIS is using this platform, you should maybe do something. We're leaving it to your discretion, but there's actual terrorist or criminal activity happening. The problem is, while that is legitimate, what we saw from the Twitter files related disclosures is that they were routinely flagging acceptable American dialogue as originating from Russia or being bot activity when they were just wrong. And the moderators knew they were wrong and were in some cases afraid to stand up to the government and say, but you're just wrong about this. That's what's so scary.
Yeah, the lack of discretion and also the secrecy around it. If this is just a notification and it's no big deal, you can make some of it public. Like Twitter and other platforms, they have quarterly statements on how much content they take down, what the purpose is, things like that. Why can't the government do that? I mean, this is taxpayer funded. The public is financing these efforts, but they can't know anything about it. I mean, before the Twitter files, we had very little inkling about what was going on. And to the extent that I've been able to shed any light on it, I've had to do FOIA. I've had to do, time consuming investigation, and all of this stuff could just be proactively put out there, and that would remove the mystique around it and maybe make people less scared of it. But the federal government doesn't seem interested in that. They want to have their cake and eat it. They want to have the secrecy and the authority without the attendant oversight or transparency.
Yeah, some kind of Hatch Act type thing that constrains or forces to disclose or make transparent the government agent's behavior would be, I think, the right way to go about this, rather than having new and additional requirements for the platforms themselves. That sometimes runs into First Amendment problems. But we can constrain what the government agents are doing, or just at least disclose, like you said.
Yeah, exactly.
Ken Klippenstein, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate it.
My pleasure, Robby.
Thanks for watching. This is Undercurrents with Unheard. You can head to undercurrents.tv to watch premium content. Please like, share, and subscribe. Again, I'm Robby Soave, filling in for Emily Jashinsky. Thanks for watching.